Hi everyone, welcome again to our study and our reading through the Bible. As we go forward, some of you may be perhaps beginning to get a little bit behind, but I want to encourage you today, keep going. If you need help, if you have questions, let me know. This week we will finish Genesis, one of the longer books of the Bible. And this week we will get about halfway through the Gospel of Matthew. I want you to know you can do it. Keep going. Much of this week is spent with the story of Joseph. Now, there are actually two Josephs in the Bible. We read about the story of Joseph, the earthly father, a figure of Jesus during the Advent season, and we just read about that during the first week of our Through the Bible. But the Old Testament story of Joseph is one of the most beloved of Scripture. Joseph is the story of Jacob's son, given to him by the wife he loved, Rebekah. He is spoiled by his father, and his brothers are jealous, and they end up hating him. In the end, they actually sell him into slavery. Yet God stays with him throughout his life. What we will discover in Joseph is we will discover a man who makes mistakes early by sharing his dream, but he's also a man full of faith. He's full of God's wisdom. He is fully trusting God, and he has much integrity. And in the end, he becomes one who is able to forgive, to see that God was working even in the difficult periods of his life. I'm not going to say a lot except to say, enjoy Joseph's story. And as you come to the end of his story, note the great verse in chapter 50, verse 20, last chapter in Genesis. We read this: speaking to his brothers who had once sold him into slavery, Joseph says, "You intend to harm me, but God intended it all for good. He brought me to this position so I could save the lives of many people." Joseph was able to come to the point that he forgave his brothers and realized that even in their hatred, God had worked for good. Sometimes in life, bad things happen. People hurt us deeply, and we don't know why. Yet if we wait, trust God, forgive them, and then continue to live faithfully and with integrity, we will discover, perhaps much later, that God had a bigger plan all around, and it is a better plan all around. You see, God works for good even when we are not sure how or why. Perhaps you want to reread Romans 8:28. God was faithful to Joseph. God will be faithful to you as well. Later this week, we will also move to the book of Exodus. It begins with the descendants of Abraham in Egypt. We're going to go back to that promise of God made to Abraham in Genesis 12 and then repeated to Isaac and Jacob. Remember what it was? Land and descendants. When the promise was given, the land was right in front of them, but there were no descendants. But God was faithful. God provided for Abraham, gave descendants to him, and began to build that great nation. Abraham had one son. Isaac had two sons. Jacob, from whom the promise would come, had 12 sons. And here at the beginning of Exodus, we see a great nation. However, we also notice that they are no longer in the land that God had promised. Exodus begins with the great nation in Egypt, and they had been placed in slavery after Joseph's death. Their lives were hard and their suffering was great. Yet God had not forgotten God's covenant with the descendants of Abraham, and God had not deserted God's people. After describing the plight of the people and the birth and upbringing of one special person, Moses, God calls out to this person, Moses, and we hear these words. Then the Lord told him, I have certainly seen the oppression of my people in Egypt. I have heard their cries of distress because of their harsh slave drivers. Yes, I am aware of their suffering. God assures Moses that God hears and sees the plight of God's people and calls Moses to go and bring his people out of Egypt to the land that had been promised. Of course, perhaps you know the story. Moses balks. Moses gives excuses. Moses says, no thanks. But in the end, God says, go. The story of the Israelites and Moses is our story as well. We live close to people who live with oppression. It may not be slavery, but it could be oppressed by homelessness, hunger, loneliness, or a myriad of other things. God hears and sees them as well. And God calls those of us who come to holy ground to go and do something to help deliver them. God calls you, and God has called me. We cannot simply see or read the Moses story or any of the Bible stories as historical events. Of course, they are historical events, don't get me wrong, but they are also our stories. And God calls us away from self. God calls us to go beyond our comfort zones. God calls us to partner with others who have different gifts. And God calls us to go and help. As you read these first few chapters of Exodus, remember that God hears and sees those who are oppressed, and God sends us to help and offer the good news. Well, the New Testament stories of Jesus are mostly familiar stories. Jesus encourages John the Baptist by reminding him of all the good that is being done and the ways God is working. You know, we can get frustrated in our lives, but if we open our eyes and our ears, we will see that God is at work. In recent sermons, I have been sharing the importance of looking for God's glory all around us. I'm afraid sometimes we hear and see so much doom and gloom that we forget that God is still at work. God is still revealing God's self to the world every day. And this week, we will also see Jesus teach through parables. Great parables. One in particular, the parable of the sower, shows us that some people will hear the word, but allow other things to block it out. Only a few will hear the word, acknowledge the word, and then begin to put it into practice and bear fruit. My question to you is, will you be one of those? Will you hear and obey? Will the roots go down deep into your heart and your soul? Well, we finished the New Testament readings with the Jesus feeding the 5,000 and Jesus walking on water, stories that are probably familiar to you. We are reminded that we must keep our eyes on Jesus. And if we do, we will do amazing things. That's what Peter did. But when Peter took his eyes off Jesus, looking at the winds, he began to sink. When we take our eyes off Jesus and look more at the troubles around us, we too may begin to sink in life. We keep our eyes on Jesus. Well, this week's Bible stories are somewhat familiar and for the most part easy to follow along and continue to read. And I hope you will enjoy your reading. Listen for God's voice. Always listen as you read, and then be willing to put it into practice. Put your comments below, email me, and ask me some questions if need be. I offer God's blessings to you.